Most Americans believe in heaven, and many think you can get there by being a good person. Makes sense, right? Seems reasonable that good people end up in a good place. You wouldn't expect to see Hitler or Netflix cheaters getting into the eternal sky fiesta. This line of reasoning also makes sense with the principle of cause and effect. If Timmy doesn't wear sunscreen to the beach, he can count on getting a sunburn. If the cause is Beyonce, it follows that the effect is fabulous. And to most Americans, if the cause is being a good person, the effect is going to heaven when we die. I like to call it the good person theory, but there's a problem with the good person theory, and that's the perfection clause. The perfection clause is another term I made up, but it describes a biblical concept that comes from Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. In verse 20, Jesus says, "But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." To put things into context, teachers of the religious law and Pharisees were considered the best of the best in moral character. Today, it would be kind of like if Jesus said, unless you're better than Mother Teresa or Keanu Reeves, you're never making it into heaven. Tough standard, right? It's like the good person theory is now becoming the best person theory. At the end of the chapter, Jesus makes his point painfully clear. Verse 48 says, "But you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." According to the perfection clause, we have to be flawless to make it into heaven. Being a good person just won't cut it. But us turn of the millennium kids taught by philosopher Montana already know nobody's perfect. So, if God is perfect, and we have to be too, how can any of us make it to heaven? The answer starts at the beginning of the chapter that wrecked our good person theory in the first place. Matthew chapter 5 verse 3 says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Poor in spirit here means people who are spiritually bankrupt. Think of someone drowning in credit card debt or student loans with no way to pay it all back. In other words, Jesus is saying that people who make it to heaven aren't the ones convinced they have it all together, but the ones who know they messed up and can't put any cash back into the bank accounts. These people are blessed because their debts are forgiven and they are given a new line of credit entirely. That new account comes from Jesus himself. Jesus didn't just talk riddles in the book of Matthew. He was a real dude too, and the Bible says he was God in the flesh. Jesus did what no one was ever able to do. He lived a perfect life. Despite being perfect, Jesus was around during the time of high political tensions and was eventually crucified by the Romans. If you're unfamiliar with crucifixion, it was a pretty bad way to go out. After hours of torture and public ridicule, Jesus died. But for being the sage, compassionate, omnipotent God incarnate, Jesus chose some weird last words. It is finished. Those 12 letters explain the spiritual reason behind his physical death. Let's go back to our broke person analogy. When you can't pay a debt, there's a fee. But the Bible says the fee we owe God for our sin is separation from him. Yet, instead of leaving us broke, alone to fend for ourselves, Jesus paid the debt penalty on our behalf when he died. Not only that, God transferred Jesus' perfection to our accounts, making anyone who counts on him counted perfect too. And spoiler alert, Jesus didn't stay dead. 3 days later, he came back to life, becoming not only the figurehead for the biggest plot twist ever, but also proving that he is, in fact, God. So, being a good person isn't such good news after all, but there's something better instead, and that is absolute perfection.